She came off the stage on a Tuesday in late October, the last of 4 passengers, with a single trunk and a letter folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. The town of Harlan Creek sat in a broad valley between the eastern foothills, the kind of settlement that had been hauled into existence by the railroad and was still deciding what it wanted to be. A main street of raw lumber and painted tin signs, a church that had been finished on the outside and not yet on the inside. 2 saloons and a hotel that charged the same rate for rooms you could hear the saloons from and rooms you could not. Marta Vesic stepped down from the stage and stood on the packed dirt with her trunk beside her and looked at the valley and the sky above it, that pale October sky going in every direction at once, so different from the narrow city street she had left behind in St. Port. Louise, she was 24 years old, brown hair braided and pinned, a gray wool dress she had sewn herself the previous winter, practical and decent. Her hands were steady at her sides. The letter was from a man named Edmund Calloway, who had written to the agency 6 months prior, seeking a woman of sound character and domestic skill, capable of managing a working ranch household in western Colorado Territory. He had written well, plainly, without flourish, describing the work honestly and the loneliness more honestly still. He was 37, widowed 4 years, 1 grown brother still on the property. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles east. There was a view of the mountains from the kitchen window that he thought a person might come to love. In time, Marta had read the letter twice and accepted the arrangement. She had spent 3 years as a seamstress in St. Louis after the death of her father, a Czech immigrant who had come to America with a cabinet-maker's hands and a heart that gave out too soon. She had no sisters, no uncles near enough to matter, and a city that had never entirely decided to include her. When the agency posting came through the woman who ran the rooming house, Marta had held it in her hands for a long evening. There was no one on the platform who looked like the photograph Edmund Calloway had sent. A round-faced man with close-cropped hair and a careful expression taken outside a farmhouse in good light. Marta waited with her trunk, while the other passengers collected their bags and dispersed into the afternoon. The stage driver tipped his hat and climbed back to his seat. A boy of about 12 ran past with something in a jar. She was still waiting when the man came. He came on foot from the direction of the feed store, walking with a particular economy of a man who did not waste motion, not slow, not hurried, just direct. He was tall enough to have to mind doorways, with dark hair that needed cutting and 3 days of beard, and the look of a man who had not slept as much as he should have. He wore a canvas-work coat, dusty at the shoulder, and his hat was pushed back in the manner of a man who had been wearing it since before sunup and had stopped thinking about it. He stopped at a distance of about 10 feet and looked at her with dark gray eyes that were not unkind, but were not warm either. The look of a man doing a difficult arithmetic. "You're Marta Vesic," he said. He took his hat off and held it in both hands, which was either courtesy or what a man did when he needed something to hold. He looked at the hat for a moment and then back at her. "Edmund's dead," he said, 3 weeks back. It came on fast and didn't leave him much time. The October sky went on above them both. Marta stood very still. She had arranged herself the entire journey, not to arrive needing comfort, not to step off that stage as a woman requiring rescue. She had done the thing she had set out to do. She had come. She held the letter, and she held her spine, and she let the words settle into the ground beneath her feet where they belonged. "I'm sorry," she said, and she was. "I'm Cormac," he said. "Younger brother." He held the hat a moment longer. "Edmund wrote the agency before he got sick. I don't know if he sent a second letter. There wasn't time at the end for much. He didn't, Marta said. Cormac nodded as though he had expected that. He looked at her trunk, and then at the distance between the platform and the road, and something behind his eyes made a decision that his face did not fully announce. "I've got the wagon," he said. "I'll take you to the house." She looked at him. "You don't have to do that. I know it," he said, and picked up the near end of her trunk. They rode out of Harlan Creek in the last of the afternoon light, without speaking much, the wagon track running northwest through grass that had gone the color of straw. The mountains in the west were already taking the shadow of the late hour, the peaks dusted with early snow. A pair of hawks worked a thermal over a distant ridgeline. Marta sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the country, and did not fill the quiet with questions, which Cormac noticed without meaning to. He had spent 3 weeks alone on the property since Edmund died, and the quiet of it had a different texture than the quiet of a person choosing not to speak unnecessarily. The house came into view around a bend of cottonwoods, a low, solid structure of hewn log and board, a porch running the front length, a barn behind, a fenced pasture with 3 horses, who came to the fence to watch the wagon pass, a woodpile stacked against the east side of the house that someone had been building all fall, a kitchen garden, mostly spent now, the last of the squash still on the vine. It was a good place. She could see that Edmund had not been wrong about that. Cormac pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down without ceremony. He lifted her trunk from the wagon bed and set it on the porch. "There's a room at the back of the house," he said. "Edmund's things are still in the front bedroom. I've been sleeping in the barn." Marta looked at him. "You've been sleeping in the barn for 3 weeks." "The house felt wrong," he said, in the tone of a man who had not meant to say that much. She looked at the house. Then she looked at him. "The contract," he said. "Edmund filed a contract with the agency. He paid the fare. I don't know what that means now in terms of what's owed. I've got nothing to say to sending you back to St. Louis, but I understand if that's what you want. I can write the agency in the morning and see what they say about the money side of it." Marta said, "I'm not going back to St. Louis." He waited. "I came here to work," she said. "There's a house that needs keeping, and I imagine a ranch that needs managing. I can do those things." "It's just the 2 of us," he said. "People will say what they say." "People will," she agreed. "That's not a reason." He looked at her with those gray eyes for a long moment, as though he were trying to determine whether she understood the particular difficulty of the situation, or was simply undeterred by it. He seemed to decide it was the latter, and that the latter might be sufficient. "Then you can stay," he said, "until we've figured out the shape of things." He carried her trunk inside without asking, and set it at the foot of the back room bed and left her to it. The house had the feeling of a place holding its breath. It was clean, more or less, the kind of clean that comes from a man who understood necessity but not comfort, who swept the floor and washed the dishes and let the rest accumulate a stillness that was not quite neglect. Edmund's coat still hung on the peg near the front door. His pipe was on the shelf above the fireplace. A Bible on the side table with a ribbon still marking a page, as though he had merely stepped out and would be back to finish the chapter. Cormac did not come back into the house that first night. Marta built a fire in the kitchen stove, which had gone cold, and found what was in the larder and made a meal for herself, a plain potato soup that filled the kitchen with a smell that was the first warm thing the house had held in weeks. She ate at the kitchen table alone, looking out at the dark yard, and then she washed her bowl and banked the fire and went to bed. She lay awake for a while, listening to the particular sounds of the country, wind in the cottonwoods, a horse moving in the barn. the vast and absolute silence beneath all of it that a city woman learns only slowly to read as peace. In the morning she found Cormac at the barn. Before first light, he was already at work. There was always work on a ranch in the way that the ocean is always wet, repairing a section of fence board that a horse had worked loose. He did not appear surprised to find her there. "I'll start on the kitchen," she said. "You don't have to," he said. "I know it," she said, and went back inside. She worked through the morning with the particular thoroughness of a woman who understands that a house is either maintained or it begins, slowly, to give way. She found the cleaning cloths and the tallow soap, and she went through the kitchen first, and then the front room, not removing anything from where it sat. Not Edmund's pipe, not the marked Bible, nothing, but cleaning around and beneath and behind, so that the house was clean in a way that respected what it was. Cormac came in at midday and stood in the doorway of the front room for a moment. "I haven't touched his things," she said without turning. She heard him exhale, slow and measured. "Thank you," he said. It was the first time she had heard him say it, and she understood from the sound of it that it did not come easily to him. That gratitude sat in him like something he had not had much recent occasion to practice. The days found their shape the way water finds the path of least resistance, not by anyone deciding it, but by the same actions repeated enough times that they began to have the quality of arrangement. Marta was up before light. The fire first, then the coffee, then whatever the morning required. She learned quickly what the ranch needed, the rhythm of it, the particular logic of a working property that had been built over years into a system with its own internal sense. Edmund's ledger was in the kitchen drawer, and she read it carefully. The accounts, the notes about which horses needed what, the agreements with the neighbors, the record of crops and yields and weather. It was a life's work written in plain figures, and she gave it the attention it deserved. Cormac worked from first light to last without complaint and without conversation, unless the work required it. He was not unfriendly. Exactly, he was something harder to describe, a man whose social equipment had rusted somewhat from disuse. He had been on this ranch for his entire adult life, first with his parents, and then with Edmund, and Edmund had been the one with the words and the easy manner and the ability to walk into a room. Cormac had been the one who did the work when Edmund was talking, and who understood, in the way of younger brothers everywhere, that this had always been the rightful division. He was grieving. She could see it in him the way you see a thing that a person is carrying under a coat, the particular set of the shoulders, the way the eyes went away sometimes in the middle of a sentence, the fact that he never used Edmund's name if he could help it, as though the name cost something each time. She did not press him. She fed him. That was what she could do. And she did it well, and there is a language in a meal set before a grieving man that is not English and does not require translation. He cleaned his plate and said little, and she asked him nothing. He was not ready to answer. One evening, in the second week, she found him sitting on the porch after supper with Edmund's pipe in his hands, not smoking it, just holding it. She brought out the 2 coffee cups and set one near his hand and went back inside without speaking. Half an hour later the cup was empty. She washed it with the others. Harlan Creek had opinions about the situation at the Calloway place the way Harlan Creek had opinions about everything, thoroughly, collectively, and beginning before all the facts were in. The first time Marta came into town was the second Friday after her arrival. She came for flour and salt and the 2 bolts of cloth she needed to repair the kitchen curtains, which were beyond the help of mending. She drove the wagon herself, which a woman of her background understood perfectly well how to do, and tied the horses in front of the general store with a knot that satisfied her. The woman behind the counter was named Helen, a solid, deliberate woman in her 50s with a talent for receiving information, while appearing to give it. "You're the woman from the Calloway place," Helen said. "I am," Marta said. "Marta Vesek. I'll need 2 pounds of flour, a ½ pound of salt, and those bolts of calico if you have them." Helen measured and wrapped. "Edmund Calloway was a good man," she said. "The town misses him." "He seemed like one," Marta said. "I'm sorry I didn't get to know him." Helen set the wrapped parcels on the counter and looked at her with the frank assessment of a woman who has seen enough of the world not to be surprised by it. "Cormac's a different sort," she said neutrally. "He is," Marta agreed. She paid and loaded her parcels and drove back through town with the particular economy of motion of a woman who does not need anyone to watch her do things. The opinions did not disappear, but they became more careful. Harlan Creek was a small place, and small places have a specific respect for people who do the work and don't make a noise about it. By the end of the first month, the stories about the strange arrangement at the Calloway place had largely given way to the simpler fact that the Calloway place looked different these days. Smoke from the chimney at the right hours, the kitchen garden dug and put to bed for winter. Who had been carrying himself like a man, recently broken, looking incrementally more like himself. There was a woman named Pearl Cutter who made it her business to say the word improper in the hearing of anyone who would listen, and Pearl Cutter had a talent for placing herself at the center of gatherings where the listening was best. But Pearl Cutter had said improper about enough things over the years that the word had worn smooth and people tended to weigh it accordingly. Marta heard it repeated back to her once, in the dry goods, from a woman who had the manner of someone warning her. She stood and listened and said, "Thank you for telling me," and bought her needles and went home. It was in the 3rd week, a cold, still night, with the first hard frost already on the ground outside the window, when they had their first real conversation. Marta was at the table with the ledger, working through the fall accounts, and Cormac came in from the barn later than usual, cold and tired, and poured himself coffee from the pot she had left on the back of the stove. He looked at the ledger. "Edmund wrote that," he said. "He did. He kept good records. He was always the careful one," Cormac said. "Dates, numbers. He liked things to add up." Marta set her pencil down. "This doesn't add up quite right," she said. She turned the ledger so he could see the page. He was expecting to bring in more from the south pasture than he did. "The yield is about 40% short." Cormac looked at the figures. "The creek ran low that summer. Pasture went dry earlier than it should have. So next year, if it runs low again, it won't," he said. This was the 2nd dry year running. 3rd is unlikely. She considered this. He looked at her. There was something in his expression that shifted, the faint surprise of a man being asked his opinion about his own land by someone who expected a real answer. "If it did," he said slowly, "I'd move the herd to the north pasture earlier, take the cut in density. Better than dry loss. That's in the ledger for next year," she said, and turned the book back and made a notation. "Edmund wrote to the agency twice," he said after a moment. "I didn't know about the 2nd letter until he was already sick. He never said he'd sent for anyone. That was Edmund. He did things and told you after." "Were you angry?" she asked. The question sat there between them, clear and direct. "Not at him," Cormac said. "You can't be angry at a dead man for making arrangements." "I don't. I'm not the man who wrote that letter." "No," she said, "I know that." He looked at his coffee cup. "You came all this way," he said. "I came for a life," she said. The life that was here was different than I expected. That happens. I'm not made of glass." He looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes that had been careful with her from the beginning, but never unkind. "No," he said, "I can see that." They sat in the kitchen, with the fire in the stove, and the frost on the ground outside, and the night around the house, and something between them that had been merely practical began quietly, and without announcement, to be something else. It was Cormac who finally went into Edmund's room. It was a Saturday morning in early November, and he did it without preparation or announcement, simply walked in the door which had been shut since the funeral, and Marta heard it open, and heard the silence on the other side of it, and went on with her bread. She heard him in there for a while, moving slowly the way you move around a person's things. The sound of a drawer, the sound of something, a box perhaps, being set on the floor. She put the bread to rise, and started on the noon meal. When he came out, he was carrying Edmund's pocket watch, which he put on the shelf above the fireplace, and Edmund's spare boots, which he put by the door. He did not say anything about what he had done, or what it had cost him, and she did not ask. She handed him the cup she had poured when she heard the drawer. He took it. That afternoon he moved his bedroll from the barn to Edmund's room. There was no ceremony about it, and no discussion. She was in the kitchen when she heard the barn door, and then the front door, and then the sound of his boots on the floor of the room at the end of the hall. Outside the kitchen window, the cottonwoods had lost their last leaves, and the mountains were white. Halfway down now, and the sky above them was the deep blue of November, the kind of blue that only comes on cold, clear days when the air is still and sharp. It was a different house from what it had been in October. She could feel it. The specific way a house changes when the person living in it decides to actually inhabit it. Something that had been held at a slight remove came the rest of the way in. She made a better supper than usual that night. Not a celebration, nothing so pointed as that. Just a meal that was a little more careful than the circumstance strictly required. The way you might set the table slightly better on a day that deserves to be marked without being named. Cormac ate it and looked across the table when he was done. "That was good," he said. "There's more," she said. He took more. The November storm came on a Wednesday without much warning. What had been a grey sky at noon was a moving wall of cloud by mid-afternoon, and by the time Marta had realized the severity of it, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. She got the chickens in first, then the garden tools, then the rain barrels secured before the wind could tip it. She was on the second round of the yard, checking the barn latch, when Cormac came up the north road at a canter, already reading the sky. "Horses," he said, dismounting without raking stride. "Done," she said. "Chickens, too." He looked at her, the quick assessment of a man who has managed emergencies alone for a long time and is recalculating in real time what it means to manage them with another person present. Something in his face settled. "Come inside," he said. "I'll get the rest. I can get the wood pile covered. I'll get it. Go in." There was a quality to the way he said it, not a command. Exactly the way you speak to someone you want accounted for. She went inside. The storm hit fully within the hour, driving snow sideways across the valley, with the specific ferocity of a mountain winter, doing what mountain winters do. The windows rattled in their frames. The temperature in the house dropped despite the fire, and Marta built the fire in the stove until the kitchen was almost hot, and let that do what it would for the rest of the rooms. Cormac came in wet and cold, and she handed him a dry shirt from the linens she had washed that morning, still warm from the rack near the stove, and did not look at him with any expression that would require him to explain himself. He thanked her, and changed, and came to the stove, and stood there warming his hands. They played cards that evening while the storm went on outside. Marta had a deck she had carried from Sente. Louis worn at the corners, and she taught him a check card game her father had played, which had rules that seemed arbitrary, until the third game, when the logic of them snapped into place. He paid attention the way a man pays attention to something that is genuinely interesting to him, and by the fourth game, he was winning. "You're quick," she said. "I've had all winter to sit with it," he said. Outside the storm, pressed at the house and the fire kept steady, and the house held them both without difficulty. There was a quietness between them that was different from the quietness of the early weeks, not the careful distance of two people being politely strangers, but the particular ease of two people who have begun to understand each other's rhythms. The way she knew he took his coffee black and needed a moment in the morning before he was ready to speak. The way he knew she worked from the hardest thing to the easiest and needed to finish what she started. The way they could occupy the same room for an hour without speaking and have it be comfortable rather than tense. She thought in the warmth of the kitchen, with the cards in her hand and the storm outside, that this was not what she had expected to find in Colorado territory. She had expected a practical arrangement. She had expected to learn to tolerate a stranger and to be tolerated in return. She had not expected to find a man who was beneath the quiet and the grief and the walls he had built up from years of carrying everything himself, genuinely worth knowing. She put that thought away and played her cards. She found the photograph in the third week of November, tucked in the back of the kitchen Bible, Edmund on the left and Cormac on the right, taken perhaps 5 years prior, both in their Sunday clothes. Edmund had the round, open face of the letter, smiling, easy in front of a lens. Cormac younger in the photograph by some years, but unmistakably himself, the same set to the jaw, the same particular steadiness, though without the current weight of grief behind his eyes. You could see it in the particular way they stood, the shared height, the shared structure, the way they both angled slightly toward one another without appearing to notice they were doing it. She put the photograph on the shelf with Edmund's pipe and his watch. Cormac saw it that evening and stopped. He stood and looked at it for a long time. "Where did you find that?" "In the Bible. I thought it should be somewhere. It could be seen." He picked it up and held it, and set it back down with the particular careful precision of a man handling something he cannot afford to break. He was 32 in this, Cormac said. He had just paid off the South parcel. He was proud of that, he was. He told everyone. Cormac's voice had a warmth in it that Marta had not heard before. He was like that. When something went right, he wanted everyone to know. When something went wrong, he kept it to himself, the opposite of me. "Is that what you do?" He looked at her. "What? Keep it to yourself when things go wrong." A pause. "Mostly," he said. She nodded once, no elaboration, and went back to the stove. He stood at the shelf a moment longer, and then came and sat at the table, and she poured him coffee without asking, and they were both quiet in the way of people who have said the thing that needed saying and don't need to say anything more about it. December came in hard and stayed. The routine held, solid and familiar by now, the fire and the coffee, the horses and the feeding, the work that expanded in winter to fill the time the outdoor work contracted. Marta had learned the ranch now in the way you learn a language, not by studying it, but by living inside it, until its logic became intuitive. She knew which horses needed watching. She knew which fence posts along the east boundary were sound and which were troubling. She knew the particular sound the front room chimney made when the wind was from the northwest and likely to bring snow. She knew the look of the sky over the mountains that meant a storm and the look that meant merely cold. Cormac watched her acquire this knowledge with the particular expression of a man who is surprised to find something he had not known he was hoping for. One morning he came in from the horses to find her teaching herself to splice rope from a length he had left on the porch, working through the technique methodically by feel. She looked up. "I found a diagram in Edmund's supply book," she said. He looked at her hands at the half-finished splice. "You're going the wrong direction on the second strand," he said. "I thought I might be." He sat down across from her and showed her with his own hands the right direction, the particular tension required, the way to seat the strand so it would hold under load. She watched, and then tried it, and he corrected her once more, and then it was right. "Good," he said. It was the same word he used for a fence post set properly, and a horse brought in at the right time, and a decision made correctly about the ranch's accounts. A simple word that in his usage carried significant weight because he did not use it when he did not mean it. They repaired the barn door that afternoon together, working in the cold with the particular efficiency of two people who no longer needed to narrate their collaboration. She held the frame while he set the hinge. He held the door while she fitted the latch pin, the kind of work that is harder alone and easier together, in the straightforward way of physical reality. Walking back to the house afterward, their breath visible in the cold air, she thought about Edmund's letter, the careful plainness of it, the honesty about the loneliness. She thought Cormac was also lonely, and had been for longer than Edmund's death, had perhaps been lonely in the way of a man who stands at the edge of things and does the work, and believes, reasonably, that the life you are built for is the only life available to you. She did not say this, but she thought it. She made a Christmas. This surprised him. It seemed to surprise him in the way of something he had not thought about until it was happening in front of him, the evergreen boughs she had cut from the trees at the property's north edge, the candles set in the kitchen window, the particular smell of the spiced bread she had found her mother's recipe for in the memory of her hands, and made on Christmas Eve with the slow, deliberate care of someone recovering something they had thought lost. He stood in the kitchen doorway that morning and looked at the table set with the boughs and the candles and the bread, and something moved across his face that he did not this time set entirely aside. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I wanted to," she said. Edmund would have wanted it. He was quiet for a moment. He would have, Cormac said. He liked Christmas. He was the one who always. "Last year was the first time we didn't do any of it." She poured his coffee and set it at his place. "Then this year we do," she said. He sat down. He looked at the table. He looked at the bread she had made, at the careful way she had arranged the boughs, at the candles she had lit that morning, and already replaced once because the first ones had burned down. "Marta," he said. She looked at him. "I'm glad you didn't go back to St. Louis." She held his gaze. The kitchen was warm and the candles were burning, and outside the December fields were white and still. "So am I," she said. They ate Christmas breakfast together, and the house was full of the smell of spiced bread and coffee and pine, and outside the mountains were white and clear in a cold winter sun, and for the first time in more than a year, the Calloway Ranch felt like a home. In January, she wrote a letter to the agency. She sat at the kitchen table on a quiet afternoon when Cormac was out with the horses and wrote it carefully in her good hand, explaining the situation with Edmund's death and the arrangement she had made with his brother and that she was well and the situation was decent, she did not send it. She held it for 2 days, which became 4, and on the 4th day she read it again and understood what she had not been willing to name when she wrote it. The letter said she was comfortable, and the arrangement was decent. Those things were true. They were not. She understood now the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had come to Western Colorado Territory, expecting a man she had read about in a letter, and had found instead a different man, quieter and harder, and more genuinely himself in ways that the letter had not described. She had found grief, and she had found silence, and she had found inside both of those things someone worth grieving with. She put the letter in the kitchen stove. She had come here for a life, and the life she had found was not the one she had agreed to on paper. It was harder and stranger and more true. She was not going anywhere. It was February before anything was said plainly, and it was said by Cormac, which surprised her, because she had begun to suspect that the saying of things that mattered was not something he would ever fully manage. It was an evening in the middle of the month. The worst of the winter was done or nearly done. She could feel it in the air, the particular quality of cold that is cold, but no longer savage. They had eaten supper, and he had helped clear the table, which he had begun doing in December, without comment, and she was washing the dishes when he stood behind her and said her name. She turned. He was standing with his hands at his sides, looking at her with an expression that was as unguarded as she had ever seen on him. The careful walls temporarily absent, the grief still there but no longer the only thing. "I don't know how to say this the right way," he said. "Say it the way you know," she said. "The way Edmund wrote that letter," he said, explaining the house and the work and the view from the kitchen window. He wrote it because he thought a woman might come to love it in time. He looked at her. I think he was right. I think maybe he knew what he was doing, more than I gave him credit for. "Cormac, I'm not Edmund," he said. "I know that. And I know this isn't what you agreed to. You came for something that isn't what you got, and I'm not asking you to. I'm not asking anything. I just wanted to say that the house is different since you came, and I don't know what the right word is for what's happened here, but I know I'm grateful for it, and I know that's not enough of a word." She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was warm, and the fire in the stove was steady, and outside the February stars were the specific sharp clarity of high-altitude cold. "You're right, that it's not what I agreed to," she said. "I agreed to a practical arrangement with a man I didn't know. That's not what this is anymore." "No," he said. "What this is," she said carefully, "is something I didn't expect and wouldn't trade." He exhaled. "Marta," he said, her name in his voice carrying everything it had accumulated over these months. The evenings at the table and the storm cards and the Christmas breakfast and the mornings when they drank coffee in the quiet before the day started. "Certain of." "I know," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her hands in his, and held them both large and rough and warm, and she looked up at him, and the thing that had been quietly growing in this house since October was simply, finally acknowledged. He asked her to marry him the following Sunday, in plain, honest words, no flourish, no particular ceremony, standing on the front porch in the late winter sun. She said yes, with the same plainness and the same honesty, and they stood for a moment looking out at the valley and the mountains beyond it and the cottonwoods beginning just at the tips to think about spring. They married in the church in March, on a morning when the ground was still frozen, but the air had the first real warmth of spring coming through it. Helen Marsh was there, and Dale Marsh, her husband, and the minister who had finished the inside of the church over the winter and was pleased to have occasion to use it. A few others from the farms and ranches nearby, neighbors who had found, over the winter, reasons to come by the Calloway place and had returned to town with the report that whatever the arrangement was out there, it was a decent one and the property was in better shape than it had been since before Edmund's death. Pearl Cutter did not attend, which was, in its own way, a form of respect. Marta wore the grey dress she had sewn herself in St. Louis, which had survived the journey better than she had given it credit for. She had let it out slightly at the waist and added a collar of white lawn she had found in the dry goods, and she carried a small bunch of dried flowers that Helen Marsh had pressed for her from the previous summer's garden. Cormac wore his good coat and had gotten his hair cut, which was a significant gesture from a man who had not visited the barber since October. He stood at the front of the church with the minister and watched her come up the aisle, and there was something in his face that was entirely without performance. A man looking at the specific person he had not known he was going to find. The words were plain, and the ceremony was short, and the minister said something at the end about two people building a life on the same ground, and Marta thought about Edmund as she had thought about him throughout, with gratitude and a kind of tenderness for a man she had never met who had, from whatever place letters come from, gotten the right people to the right place. Outside the church the spring air was bright, and the cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning to bud, and somewhere, above the valley, two hawks were working the same thermal they had been working the afternoon she arrived. Cormac took her hand as they came out of the church, and she let the spring sun come down on them both. The ranch came back to life in April, the way ranches do, not all at once, but incrementally, the way the cold releases, 1 degree at a time, until the morning comes when you step outside and the air is simply different. The kitchen garden she planted that spring was larger than the one in Edmund's ledger. She had been thinking about it through the winter, adding and revising, working out what the soil in this valley would hold and what the altitude would allow. She planted what she knew and a few things she had never grown before, because this was her ground now and she had the right to experiment. Cormac watched her put in the seedlings one morning with an expression she had come to recognize. The specific look of a man seeing competence applied to something he cares about and feeling, privately, the satisfaction of it. "You know what you're doing," he said. "I'm learning what this particular ground does," she said. "That's different." He crouched beside her and picked up a handful of soil and let it run through his fingers, reading it the way a man reads something he has known his whole life. "South End is better drained," he said. "Squash and beans would do better down there." "That's what I thought," she said. "I put the beans down there." He looked at the planted row, and then at her, and the corner of his mouth moved in the small private way it had. "Good," he said. Edmund's pipe was still on the shelf above the fireplace. The Bible with the ribbon was still on the side table, marking the page it had always marked. The photograph of the two brothers in their Sunday clothes stood on the shelf where Marta had put it in November and had not moved since. These things had their place and they would keep it. That was how she had understood this house from the beginning. It was not a house that needed to be made into something it had not been. It needed to be the house it was only inhabited by someone who intended to stay. She intended to stay. The spring came fully in the way of Colorado springs, sudden and generous after the long winter, the valley going green almost overnight, and the creek running full and cold, and the mountains above it showing the specific blue-white of the late snowpack. The horses were in good condition, the south pasture was ready, The fence Cormac had spent the winter repairing was sound along every line. She found him on the porch one evening in late April, the end of a long day's work, sitting in the chair that had always been Edmund's chair because it was the one facing the mountains, and she brought out the 2 coffee cups and sat beside him, and they watched the last light go off the peak. "He would have liked this spring," Cormac said. "He would have," she agreed. "He would have liked you," he said. She considered this honestly. "I hope so," she said. The evening settled around them, warm and still, the first truly warm evening of the year, the kind that makes you understand why people stay in a place. The cottonwoods were fully leafed now, and the grass was the green of new grass, and the creek sound came up through the air, steady and clean. "I wrote the agency," Cormac said after a while. She looked at him. "I told them the arrangement had resolved itself satisfactorily," he said, "and that no further action was required." She looked at the mountains. "Satisfactorily," she said. "It was the word they would expect," he said, and there was something dry and warm in his voice. "It was," she agreed. She drank her coffee, and the evening continued, and somewhere down in the valley, a horse called to another horse, and was answered, and the mountains held their position above it, all indifferent and enormous, and entirely unconcerned with any particular human arrangement. That first year taught her things she had not known she would learn. She learned the names the mountains held in each season, the white of winter and the blue distance of summer, and the gold they showed in October when the aspens turned. She learned to read the sky the way Cormac read it, not as weather, but as information about what the next hours required. She learned the social geography of the valley, which neighbors could be trusted with what, the alliances and old grievances, the specific mercy a small place extended to people who did their work and kept their word. She learned that Cormac was not a simple man. He had opinions he held with force, but expressed only when asked, so most people thought he had none. The shelf in the front room held poetry and history behind the practical volumes, and one battered novel repaired with cord from being read past the point of its binding. He did not explain the reading. It was something he did and did not advertise. He was patient in a way that was not passivity, the patience of a man who had decided not to hurry things that should not be hurried. He made her feel that she was not being rushed. She had not realized, until she was not, how much of her life she had spent in the implicit obligation to hurry. One morning in July, she looked up from the kitchen window, the mountains sharp and blue, and understood with a certainty that did not require examination that this was her life, not a situation she was managing. She went outside into the morning. The cottonwoods were whispering in some current of air. She could not feel herself. Cormac was at the far end of the kitchen garden, inspecting the squash. "Good," she heard him say to the squash, and something entirely involuntary happened to her face. She went to help him. What Marta had come for, in the original terms of it, was a practical life, room and purpose, and the end of uncertainty. What she had found was harder to name. She had found a man teaching himself, at 31, to let someone help him, who had spent his whole adult life in the peripheral position, the useful one, the one who did the work while Edmund did the talking, and who was slowly learning what it meant to be the central thing in a life rather than the reliable element at its edge. She had found grief that was real, Cormac's for his brother, her own for the father she had lost, and the life she had left. Grief that was not dramatic, not disabling, simply present the way all real losses are, woven into ordinary days, becoming something you carry alongside rather than underneath. She had found a partnership that did not make for a particular kind of story. not rescue, not passion at first sight. Just two people in the same place, working in the same direction, learning what the other was made of and finding it compatible in ways that mattered. Edmund Calloway had written a letter to a woman. He had known the house and the loneliness and what the place required. He had not known that the woman who answered his letter and the brother he left behind would between them make something of this land that neither of them could have managed alone. The watch was still on the shelf. The Bible held its ribbon. The photograph stood in its place. The second winter came with less difficulty than the first, not because winter had gotten easier, but because the house knew by then how to hold it. The larder was better stocked. The roof had been repaired in September, where it had been showing weakness. The barn was tight, and the horses were fat, and the south fence was sound in every post. And there was the simple fact of two people rather than one, which is its own kind of warm. Marta had a habit, in the deep cold, of working late at the kitchen table while Cormac read in the front room. Two people inhabiting the same house at different tasks, both fires burning, the house warm all the way through. They would come together at the table for the last coffee of the day, and this had become the hour she looked forward to, most the work done, just the two of them, and the firelight and whatever had been on their minds. He talked more. In this second year, not a great deal. He was always going to measure his words. But the silences had a different quality, and what broke them was more often shared than kept. He told her about his father, who had homesteaded this valley, and built the house with his own hands, who had a gift for choosing ground that would hold. He told her about the early years when the ranch was not yet what it became, and the family had made it through by the kind of collective stubbornness that becomes a legacy. She told him about her father, the cabinet-maker's hands, the songs in Czech he had sung when he thought no one could hear, the way he approached everything with the attention he brought to a joint, as though precision were a form of love. "He sounds like a good man," Cormac said. "He was," she said. "He would have liked this," she added, gesturing at nothing specific. The kitchen, the fire, the house, the mountains outside. Cormac asked, which was the most unguarded question she had ever heard him ask. She considered it properly. "Yes," she said. He had no patience for men who performed. He would have found you restful. Cormac considered this. "A compliment," she said from him. He looked at his coffee, and the corner of his mouth moved. They sat in the winter kitchen, and the second storm of the season pressed at the windows, and the fire was steady, and the house was exactly what it had become, a place that held the life it was supposed to hold. Warm all the way through, just home. If you've made it to the end of this story, it means something about it stayed with you, and that means a great deal to us. If you'd like to see more stories like Marta and Cormac's, about ordinary people who found extraordinary lives in unexpected places, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. We put these stories out because we believe the quieter kind of love, the kind built slowly out of grief and work and honest days, deserves to be told. Thank you for being here.